This episode is brought to you in part by Museum of the Bible and its new worship experience, All Creation Sings, made in partnership with Creator. Step into an immersive room with vibrant visuals, soundscapes of praise, and interactive displays illuminating the story of worship. Get tickets at museumofthebible.org/ACS.
Before we begin today's episode, I want to advise caution. Today's conversation includes discussion about sexual violence and could be triggering to some listeners. Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast. I am your host, Amber Cullum, and this week I am grateful to have Lisa Saruga on the show to share her story and the way God is using her experience to bring change. As a college freshman, Lisa was raped, knifed, and nearly suffocated by a man wearing a ski mask. 35 years later, the identity of the masked man was discovered, but a maze of legal obstacles did not lead to the justice she desired and he deserved. However, that experience opened her eyes to the huge holes in the justice system, and now, in addition to counseling, she advocates for victims' rights. How is God at work in her story? Listen in to find out. And if you are moved by her story, please share it with a friend. We can all gain encouragement, perspective, and hope from Lisa's fortitude and faith. Good morning, Lisa, and welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Good morning. It's so good to be here.
I am grateful for your time and really looking forward to our conversation. And so let's jump in because there is a lot to talk about. But I always begin with, when did you begin walking with Christ? Tell us a little bit about your faith journey. And I know that plays into a huge part of your story, which we'll get to, but primarily, when did you begin walking with Jesus?
You know, I did grow up in a church. My family was Catholic. So I always knew there was a God. I believed there was a God. I knew of Jesus. And when I went to college, that's when I started questioning. Is this all real? Why did we go there? And so during college, I did have an incident that we're going to talk about. And that did play into my belief system. And so I would say it was later in college that I finally felt that I knew Jesus, that I had a relationship with him, that I gave my life over to him.
Yeah, well, and speaking of that incident, you were in college in the 1980s and a life-altering event did happen to you, a tragic life-altering event. And so share that with us as much as you feel comfortable, just so that as we dive into this conversation, people do kind of know where we're coming from, why what we're talking about is important to you.
So I was a freshman in college. I was just 18 years old, and I was in my dorm room. My roommate was gone for the weekend, and I was asleep. It was the middle of the night, and I woke up kind of confused, didn't really know what had woken me up. And as things came into focus, I realized there was a man in a ski mask crouched next to my bed.
Oh my gosh.
And so that early morning, I was raped, knifed, and nearly suffocated by this man. I did not see his face. There was a 3-month investigation. The investigator really kind of thought my story was too far-fetched and sensationalized. So there wasn't a great deal of belief. So the investigation was short and not very thorough. And then it ended. That was it. Nobody was arrested, and nobody was talking about it. So I thought it was no big deal, and I put it away too, and didn't talk about it or think about it for a long, long time.
Oh my goodness. There are so many questions that I have about this, Lisa. And I know it was the 1980s, and so we've come a long way, but I'm like, wow. Okay. So first of all, was your dorm, were you on the first floor?
No, I was on the second floor. It was locked. He had slit a screen in the basement of the building and come in that way. And I had a friend over earlier, and I fell asleep on my bed, fully clothed. And when that person left, It was a deadbolt door lock. They couldn't lock it from the outside. So they had left my door unlocked.
Wow. And then I'm assuming, because typically this is what happens in colleges, but obviously I went to college a little bit later than that. Was it campus police that showed up to investigate?
It was.
Okay. And then so a 3-month investigation is not very long. And I'm curious, how in the world did you stuff that down and say nothing? And did you stay at your university?
At first you don't stuff it down. You live the trauma. And I was taken to the hospital. It was all reported. Mm-hmm. I did all the right things. And I was sent to a counselor. I went to counseling 2 times and decided that was enough. I didn't need to talk anymore. My mindset was, I was happy at college the day before it happened, and I needed to be happy at college again. So I went right back to class. That Monday, I didn't go home, returned to all of my activities. And this is not uncommon for people who experience sexual violence.
Okay.
It's pretty common that we just want life to go on, and no one else is talking about it. Other people move on, and so it must not be a big deal. And I don't want to be a drama queen, so I'm just, it is what it is. It's in the past. I'm going to move forward. That was really my mindset too. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the second part of your question.
Well, I mean, it's because I asked probably 4 questions in one. But I mean, and your parents felt similarly?
So that's interesting too. Because this is part of my faith journey. I really believe that we get our first impressions of God from our Father on earth. And my dad was a pretty temperamental, unpredictable man. I knew he loved me, but I was also very afraid of him. And that was my image of God. Like, God was this person up in the clouds who had a quiver of lightning bolts, and he was just waiting for me to mess up, and I was going to get zapped. So, all of that kind of tied together during this time, because honestly, my worst fear as this was happening wasn't that I would die. I was pretty sure I was going to die. My worst fear was what happens after death. Have I been good enough? Are those lightning bolts all going to come? If I survive, is God going to be mad at me? Is my dad going to be mad at me? So when I went to the hospital, they told me I had to call a parent. And I was on my dad's insurance. They dialed the phone and handed it to me. That was not my choice.
Oh, wow.
And I told my dad what happened. And here's the interesting thing. My dad handled this with so much compassion.
Oh.
He said and did the right things. He said, I want you to come home. And I said, no, I don't want to come home. He said, fine, I would like to come and see you, but you tell me when it's a good time. He handled it great. And then later that day, he came to see me at school, and he cried. That's the first time I've seen my dad cry. And it was such an expression of compassion and love. That was a real changing point. That was very pivotal in my relationship with God too, and understanding who God is. At the same time, it's very re-traumatizing every time somebody has to tell a loved one what's happened to them, because then you experience their hurt and their trauma. So this is horrible. I called my mom that day because I knew I had to. And this is what I said to her. I said, Mom, I have to tell you something. And when I'm done, I just want you to say okay and hang up the phone. And I told her what happened, and she said, okay, I love you, and she hung up the phone. And I know there was trauma after she hung up that phone.
Yes, I think about my own babies. I don't know if I could have done that.
She did, and we didn't talk about it for many, many years, really. She respected that, but
wow,
I know that was hard for her.
This episode is brought to you in part by Beyond Ordinary Women Ministries, which prepares Christian women for leadership. At BOW, we believe that every woman is a leader because she influences someone. So, whom do you influence? Do you mentor a woman? Serve in the workplace? Or do you lead a small group, teach the Bible, or even lead an entire ministry? No matter who or how many you influence, our free online resources will help equip you. Our videos, podcast episodes, and articles from experienced women leaders will encourage you and perfect your leadership skills. They offer wisdom for dealing with ministry pitfalls, current biblical issues, health for your own soul, and insights for shepherding others well. In addition, BOW offers Bible studies designed to connect women of multiple generations. They provide a challenge to both women new to the Bible and those wanting to dig deeper. Be our guest and browse all of our free resources and low-cost Bible studies at beyondordinarywomen.org.
So Lisa, because you weren't injury-free, but you went back to school on Monday, and then you also said you thought you might die. So where does that come together? Is it just because so early on, the trauma was so bad for like a couple of days that you were like, I have no idea what's going on?
It's self-preservation to just, it's like, okay, it's like something I watched on TV. I could just move on from here. My wounds weren't severe, so I was able to function.
Right, but you didn't know that like originally, when you first went in.
No, when I thought I was gonna, he told me he was going to kill me.
Okay.
I kind of was. This is interesting because I wasn't sure where I was in my faith, but I started praying out loud. Mm-hmm. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm praying." And he said, "For who?" And I said, "I'm praying for me because I'm really scared, and I'm praying for you because I think that there's a God who doesn't want you to do this."
Wow, Lisa.
So.
Oh my goodness. And so in this process, then, as you go through college, there's not really any mention of it, but Christ does begin to become a friend to you. Mm-hmm. What was that process like?
I think God surrounded me with the right friends. Mm-hmm. I became an RA on campus, and my closest friends were Christian. And we would go to Fellowship of Christian Athletes together, and I started serving in a church. Yay! I started serving in a church there with one of my friends, who's still a dear friend.
Oh, I love it.
Your eyes are open when you start making friends who have a totally different relationship with Jesus.
So true. Gosh, it's so true.
I remember the quiver of lightning bolts was always my image, and I would hear my friends like praying and talking to Jesus as if he was in the room, he was a friend. And, even sometimes they would joke while they were praying, and I'm thinking, those lightning bolts are going to hit any minute now.
And they didn't.
And I realized that they could have this prayer relationship because they weren't afraid of God. They knew God loved them. They knew Jesus loved them and died for them. And so that was just a huge eye-opening time in my life, was to make these friends who really got it and really had a relationship. And I don't want to say anything bad about the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church is where I learned about Jesus.
Right. Your foundation.
Yes. But in my particular church, we had a priest from Poland who was very, very conservative, who really didn't teach us about relationship. It was rules. Mm-hmm. So just, my background just didn't take me to a place of relationship.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like, I didn't grow up necessarily in a liturgical church, but I was in and out of a liturgical church. And that did teach more about relationship. But I think certain environments definitely lend itself better to growth in Christ in relationship when you're not getting that always at home. Like, there's not, your parents may be Christians, but they're not necessarily discipling you at home. And so the environment you're in outside of home, I think, bears a whole lot more weight.
I absolutely agree. And this is a tangent, but when I was in high school, my parents divorced.
Yeah.
My dad had just really suffered with bipolar disorder. And when my parents divorced, this priest that we had, bless him, he's I hope in heaven as we speak, but he no longer allowed my brothers and I to participate in activities in the church. When they gave Bibles to our classmates, we didn't get a Bible because our parents were divorced. It wasn't representative of all liturgical churches. This was a person who just probably didn't get it.
Right. Just very much more law-based.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, so your perpetrator did remain unknown for 35 years.
Yes.
And that is the case for some people their entire lives. But at some point, I guess I want to know first, what did day-to-day life look like during that waiting? It sounds like you just kind of put it away and didn't think about it anymore. But did the time come up where you did start thinking about it a little bit more? Or was it, you know what, this is out of the way until you get a phone call?
It was packed away. I always say it was like I had packed it away in a box and put it up on a shelf in the back of my mind, and I just didn't think about it. I hadn't, by the time what happened, and we'll talk about that. My kids were grown. They didn't know what had happened. None of my friends knew what had happened.
Wow.
I was going to be a music teacher, and, that incident changed the course of my education. I became a counselor. And I think that some people knew that I became a counselor as a result of some trauma, but I just didn't talk about it. I was able to walk with so many others on their journey to healing, but I never walked my own journey at all. It was just stowed. So,
I think I get so floored by that because I'm such an open, I just pour it all out there. But I wonder how often that does happen for someone who experienced something like you did, because to bring it back up and to talk about it again is just reliving it. Is that what you would say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just, again, it's self-preservation.
Yeah.
I'm a trauma therapist, and I have so many clients who have done that. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. I'm fine because it's just not a part of my life. And they are fine in that moment, but someday when something triggers all of that stuff to come down off of the shelf and say, here, it's time to relive this, you just don't know when that moment's coming.
Right. Well, and Dan Allender talks about that a lot, how, we can do fragmentation where we can kind of put this over here and it lives there.
Yeah.
And then this part of our life lives here. But when you see things like isolation come up, those are all actually responses to this traumatic experience that you don't even realize. That's the reason why you're doing it.
Yes. And so as a trauma therapist, I don't get too much into the science of it with clients, but
right.
Trauma lives in a part of our brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala just holds on to memories that are associated with strong emotion. And when something triggered, it's not something you can consciously access, those emotions. It's something happens unexpectedly that triggers the amygdala, and it just releases all this emotion into you. And you might not even know where it comes from. You don't associate it with an event. It's pure emotion.
Yeah.
And I do EMDR therapy with my clients because talk therapy, when you start talking about it, you could talk about it for years and still not process, because talk is all in a different
frontal
part of your
lobe,
brain.
right?
Yes,
it's
exactly.
More,
Whereas EMDR therapy really forces the brain to access amygdala.
I could talk about this all day. We need to have a whole other conversation that just has to do with trauma therapy and, secondary to your story, because that's also interwoven. But I do want to know, the day did come that your cold case was reopened. You'd lived all of these years. And what did happen? Tell me that whole process. Did you just get a phone call? Were you completely shocked?
Yes. So 35 years later, it was 2018. My husband and I had moved in with his parents to take care of them. We still do that. We still have our mother-in-law that we're taking care of. And that was a stressful time. Eventually we ended up with all four of our parents in our home with dementia and other issues.
Kudos to you.
And so I woke up one morning and I was, singing praise and worship songs, and I journal in the morning, and I was writing in my journal, and I was telling God how stressed I was. And then I wrote, how much stress do you think I can take? Never, ever ask God how much stress he thinks you can take.
It's as bad as praying for patience, right?
Exactly. He does not say he's not going to give you more than you can take. He says that he's going to be there to help you through it.
That's exactly right.
So I wrote those words and my phone rang. It was like that quick.
Oh my God.
And it was a detective from Central Michigan University, and he said, we're working on a case, and your name came up, and we need to talk to you. We're coming to your hometown today. And I asked what it was about, and he said he would share it when he got there. So I got off the phone, and my mind did not even go to that incident.
Really?
No. My mind went to, I had gone back to Central. I worked as a resident hall director there.
Mm-hmm.
I had a student that died in my hall. I had students who were involved in different things. So I'm just thinking, what could possibly be
Wow.
the issue? So here's the interesting thing that God did. When I was 18, the first person I met at Central Michigan University was a very dear friend named Tony. And Tony and I ended up being RAs together and hall directors together. He ended up being my supervisor at Central for a while. I sang at his wedding. We're still best of friends. But Tony, at that time that I got the phone call, was also the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs. He oversaw the police department as part of his job.
Wow.
So I called Tony when I got off the phone with the detective and said, I said, hey, did you and I do anything in the past that we're going to get in trouble for? Because this person's coming to talk to me. And he said, oh, I don't know.
Right. You're like, that was 20 some years ago. I think I was a decent kid, but I don't remember.
Yeah. So he got off the phone and he called the police. And about 10 minutes later, he called me back. And this is the God moment. God set Tony in my life 35 years before and made us very close friends, knowing that Tony was going to be the person to tell me that somebody had revealed the identity of the man in the ski mask.
Wow.
Isn't that incredible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was Tony that told me. I was in the living room with my husband, and I just remember I started shaking, and my amygdala went, woo! And
started shouting, didn't it?
Oh, the emotions. It was like it was 35 years ago and I was 18.
Yeah.
All I could do was cry and say no, and why would this come up again now? I didn't want any part of it. And I truly experienced PTSD for the next several months.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So people kept saying to me, you must be so excited that they found him. And I wasn't. I was just, I was having nightmares and intrusive thoughts, and I would cry and not know why I was crying. It was a horrible period of time.
And you had to tell your children, your husband.
And it was re-traumatizing, just like it was when I was 18. My husband, at the time, my youngest son was working for my husband, and he was, my husband's a builder, and my son was doing something in the backyard for a project. And when I just didn't know what to do. My husband asked if I was okay, and I said, I don't know. And, he knew that things were not good.
Right.
He was so wise. He went and got my son and brought my son in. And it was like this moment of, you survived, you had life, you've had kids, you're okay. So that was a real important moment.
So when did it end? Because it ended up in court. It didn't end up in court.
It did not.
Okay. So yeah, what happened? Did you?
So there was another 3-month investigation.
Okay.
We thought this was going to drag on for years. The prosecutor had said, he wanted to really go after this, and he was very interactive with the detective. The detective was wonderful. The first thing he said to me was, I want you to know we believe everything. We're going to do everything we can. 3 months seemed like a long, long time, because for 3 months we're waiting for them to make an arrest. And every week they would say, prosecutor should be issuing an arrest warrant, and then we can get his DNA and see what else he's linked to. And it was like 3 months of, when's it going to happen? And then the prosecutor stopped talking to the attorney, or to the detective, and we couldn't figure out why. So 3 months in, the detective kind of forced the issue and applied for an arrest warrant. And at that time, that prosecutor handed my case off to an assistant prosecutor, so the assistant prosecutor could tell us that although there's no statute of limitations in Michigan now on that law, there was in 1983, and he would never be arrested for the crime.
Oh my gosh. Why did they even contact you then?
I asked God that several times.
Right? I mean, fair.
The detective, who I just think the world of, said he asked the same thing. He was not sure he wanted to even bring it back up. But he said, I think you needed to have the right to decide what to do with the information. And he said right up front, if you don't want to press charges, we'll never mention it again. If you do, I'm all in. He left that all up to me.
But you couldn't press charges. So, I mean, it sounds like when I'm hearing this is they should have known that this statute of limitations was there before they ever contacted you.
They should have. There were some real issues with the prosecutor. He lied several times during the case. He ended up, there was quite a newsworthy incident because he had closed several sexual assault cases, and some of them without reason. So actually the Michigan Attorney General's office got involved in my case and others, and that's a whole nother story.
Right. Well, so did your perpetrator ever actually face justice? I mean, I think that he did in some regard, but I don't know that part of the story.
So he did have an incident as a teenager. My understanding is that he had an incident as a teenager where he had exposed himself to a small girl. But he was young, so they didn't arrest him. Now that's all hearsay. The person who reported him told me that. But he was arrested a few years after what he did to me. And interestingly, he was arrested. He entered a home by slitting the screen in the basement, just like he did at the residence hall. And it was a crazy incident. He was naked from the waist down. He was going through the laundry to get women's underwear, and he got caught and was arrested. So there were some fetishes there that were going on. But he did probation, and then it was expunged from his record. So he has a clean record. He's actually been a Boy Scout leader.
Goodness.
Then when my case was closed, I was told that, I don't know, if he was or wasn't, but he was a person of interest in 2 rape homicides, but they couldn't connect him to the scene. So most everyone believes, there's got to be other cases, but he has not ever served time.
So then in a situation like yours where the statute of
limitations.
Which statutory might go, that's a whole other thing, right? The statute of limitations is up and you know who it is. That's it. Just case closed.
Yep.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But I'm taking it a little further.
Well, and that's what I want. I mean, I think as I hear your story, before we move on into what you're doing now and why that finally made you say, okay, I have to speak up for this. During this time when you're like, okay, I'm experiencing PTSD, you've told us that you asked God, like, why would you even let me know this?
Yeah.
What was the tension like in your relationship with Christ at that time? Or was it tension?
It was. Journaling is what I did.
That's right.
And at one point, shortly after I learned that it was open, the case was opened. This was like a week later. It was the 4th of July, and my husband said, he knew I was sad. He knew I was struggling, and he said, let's do whatever you want today. Anything you want. The day is yours. And I said, I want to run away. And he said, where do you want to go? Or where should we go? And I said, I want to be alone. I don't know where I want to be. I just want to be anywhere but here.
Yeah.
And so my husband helped me pack and run away.
Aww.
And when he put my suitcase in the car, he said, you don't have to tell me where you go. Just let me know you're safe when you get there.
Yeah.
Which was wonderful. But I went back to the scene of the crime. And I picked up, this is my creative bent, I guess. I picked up black paper and white pens, and I started writing, and I said, because life is upside down and inside out right now, this is how I'm writing.
Yeah.
And I ended up writing white ink on black paper through that entire situation. And there were times, and I want to tell your viewers this too, because what I did was I would just write whatever was on my heart. I did not filter it. I wrote raw.
Yeah.
And then every time I ended writing, I would look for the themes in what I wrote, and maybe it was justice, or maybe it was forgiveness, or maybe it was anger, or whatever I was writing about that day. I would Google scripture on justice, scripture on whatever I was writing about, and let God speak back into it. And I would write a couple of those verses that stood out to me at the end. I did that for a year. And that was the most healing thing I could have done, because what happened was it became this dialogue with God. And when I looked back at my black paper, I realized that God and I had written a brighter future onto those dark pages. And he loved me enough to let me yell at him, to tell him how mad I was. And, go back to my earlier view that God was a God of lightning bolts. I learned that God didn't get mad at me at all. He knew exactly what I was dealing with and loved me anyway. So that was probably the most healing thing I did.
Well, and is that what you mean when something that you've said that you have written on your website is healing can be attained even when the world offers no happy ending?
Absolutely. I wrote my book. The first book I wrote was my memoir. And it was, there was a lot of excitement about it. And then there were two major publishers interested who ended up saying, I think we can publish this after you get a conviction, or if you can make a new law. Like, they wanted the happy ending. And the truth is, when it comes to sexual violence, only 2.5% of rapists go to jail. The vast majority of us don't get a happy ending. And we don't have to have a happy ending in this life for God to be able to heal us and make us whole.
Wow. It is so powerful because for a lot of reasons, that's a hope that can be hard to cling on to, that we have to repeat a lot of times more than once a day to ourselves, right?
Yes.
It's also sad to me that in the publishing world, that's what we look for. Always what's going to be wrapped up in the pretty bow. And that also is a whole other conversation. I had that a few weeks ago with Caitlin Beatty, actually, who is an acquisitions editor. Just, how do we wrestle through that in the Christian world? Because really it should look different. But I could take a lot of things from that, because Jesus really is our only hope, but it's not like he just always rides in on a white horse and sweeps us off our feet, and we don't have to remind ourselves of who he is and his consistency and his faithfulness in our mess on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And when this case opened, all I could think was, why would God let this happen 35 years later? Why now? Right? And God did show me why. But I had made up my mind that the whole reason this was reopening was to give me the two things I wanted most. I wanted justice and I wanted closure. And I was convinced God was going to send this guy to jail, and I was going to get justice and I was going to get closure. God is a just God. There will be justice. But our world isn't going to necessarily offer the justice that we want.
That's right.
And closure, God never promised us closure in this lifetime. Closure comes in the next lifetime. Then I'll have clear understanding. But what God did teach me was, in the absence of closure and justice, he still can find purpose.
Yeah.
And to me, purpose is so healing. It seems so pointless what happened. It seems so, why? Why would that need to happen? And I don't think God purposes for us to experience that kind of trauma.
Right.
But I believe he can use it for purpose.
Absolutely. And he has in your life, because while you went for decades not speaking about what happened to you, now you are someone who advocates on the behalf of other survivors of sexual violence. Talk a little bit about your advocacy work, what you do, how that has been a part of your healing process, and why it is so needed to do what you're doing.
Thank you for asking that question. This is so important to me. And you're right, I didn't talk about it for 35 years, and now they can't shut me up.
All those words that were inside are all going to come out. That's right.
So what I learned through this process was not good things. First of all, that assistant attorney general that was assigned to my case ended up sleeping with some of the victims and being arrested for criminal sexual conduct. And then I was told that there was safety issues for me, that I needed to take safety precautions. And this was a special agent from the attorney general's office, like something from TV, that this guy would call me and say, "You're in danger. And we can't help you because there was no conviction, so technically you're not a victim, and so there's no victim services."
Wow. What the heck?
Exactly. So I went to the chief of police in my hometown, who said, "Yes, we'll put together a safety plan." And then he was arrested for criminal sexual conduct.
Oh.
And so it was like God was saying, "Look, open your eyes. There's a huge problem in our nation. Things are not so different from 1983. Things have not changed a lot. We think they have because we talk about it more.
Right.
But there's all these laws that make it impossible to get justice." And, people ask me, "Don't you believe in prison reform? There's too many people going to prison." I do. I think we should get all of the nonviolent people out of jails and put the violent people in who really pose a threat to people. And so, I just really got charged up about this. So I started going to Lansing and knocking on doors and talking to legislators. I did the same thing in Washington, D.C. And here's what there's several areas that we're working on, but what my case has illustrated, there's a few things, is that there's a decision that was made by the U.S. Supreme Court called Stogner versus California that makes it impossible for states to retroactively remove statutes of limitations. So rape is a state crime. Okay. So we've got this federal law that makes the states unable to make an arrest. And then we have victim protection, which is at the federal level, but the state has to get a conviction before they'll protect.
Oh.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we've just set ourselves up so that there is no way to keep somebody safe.
Wow.
So we're working at the federal level. I would love to see Stogner versus California overturned. And at the state level, I don't want to confuse everybody, but in Michigan, the statute of limitations from 1983 says that if he had left the state to avoid being arrested, that the statute of limitations stops, it tolls, and then if he comes back to Michigan, it starts again. So he could be gone for 50 years, but when he comes back, the statute of limitations doesn't start until then, so he could have been arrested.
Oh.
But it doesn't say if he stays in the state and hides his identity that it tolls. And so we're working in Michigan to try to implement that.
Gotcha. So that if he pretends that he is someone else, because what does it mean, to hide your identity? And people who aren't interested in law at all, I understand. It's because it's hard to understand.
Right.
But like hide your identity can mean a whole lot of things.
Yeah, it just means that nobody identified him or linked him to the crime before the statute of limitations tolls.
Okay.
It's done. So, if he had left the state and I didn't know who he was, we could arrest him. But because he stayed in the state and we didn't know who he was, he can't be arrested. And to me, it's a game and he won. We may as well have played rock, paper, scissors and he wins and so he can't be arrested.
Have you looked and is there are laws very similar to that in other states?
No. In fact, Stogner versus California in the Supreme Court was based on a case where a state did say that. They said that this person could be arrested even though they didn't leave the state for various reasons. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not constitutional.
Okay.
So I don't believe the Supreme Court today would make that same decision. What they're saying is that it goes against the ex post facto clause in the Constitution, which says you can't make something illegal after the fact and then arrest somebody if it wasn't illegal when they did it.
But rape is always illegal.
Right. So the four ex post facto explanations are, the first one is can't make something illegal that wasn't legal when it was done. Well, this was illegal when it was done.
Right.
The second part of that is you can't make something a greater crime with more punishment than it was at the time it was committed.
Okay.
This was a felony then, it's a felony now. You can't increase the punishment. It was punishable by life then, it's punishable by life now. So my case shows why it would not be unconstitutional.
But that's not even a possibility to argue because of this, whatever the last name was, versus California.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
So tell me now, you know the identity of this man. Does he know who you are, name-wise? Are you allowed to answer that?
I don't know if he does. Honestly, part of the security measures that we took is I had to assume a name. So Lisa Saruga is not my real name.
Oh.
It is what I use when I'm writing, when I'm doing anything public. You know, I had to open a private LLC. Again, a whole nother story that didn't end up very private. So the information is easily accessible now. But we are very soon going to be confronting my perpetrator in a very public way. And once that happens, I'll be able to use my real name again.
Wow. I did read that it may happen that you will get to, meet him face to face. Is that the case? Like you are moving forward with that?
Yes.
Okay.
I will be giving him a Bible with my name in it. And I want him to know, I want to end this 35-year game of hide and seek. And I want him to know, who I am. So here's my real name. And if he reads this Bible, he'll know who I am.
Wow. Oh, well, Lisa, make sure that you do share, obviously, that story with me. I would love to be able to link it in this episode when it actually does go live, just because, only God knows what's actually going to come out of that, right?
Right. I'm just praying that if he runs away, I won't have the opportunity to talk with him. So I'm just praying I have a minute to talk with him.
Well, I am definitely joining you and praying for that as well. And just for your strength. We don't need the amygdala to go wild on you, right?
My amygdala is doing pretty good right now.
Well, so what does keep you pressing on in this journey that is so difficult? And I don't mean so much just your personal journey, but with anybody who legislates. It's not a easy road, but a lot of legislators aren't really as personally connected to what they're legislating as you are. So what keeps you pressing on when things I know are not easy?
That's a good question. Because there are times where this is a marathon and I may not see this change even in my lifetime. But I have legislators from both sides of the aisle who are championing this. One of the bills that I wrote has been introduced into the state legislature. And as long as there's somebody willing to support this, I just feel like somebody's got to keep it going until people take notice. Like I said, 2.5% of rapists go to jail. I work with women every single day who will never, ever see justice for the crimes that are committed against them. And to me, I can't sit still knowing that. And I know that the vast majority of women, people who have experienced sexual violence, are never going to be able to go and talk to legislators. It just isn't within them. So I just have committed. I'm going to do whatever I can do for as long as I can do it. And I have to tell you the story. I don't know if you'll use this or not, but the last time I was in Washington, D.C., I was meeting with individual legislators saying, got to overturn Stodner, and I give them all the reasons, and I make it real clear and concise for them. And I had 3 legislators tell me it'll never happen because the Supreme Court never overturns decisions unless they're challenged through the legal system, which could take decades. And that was on a Wednesday. Thursday morning, I went back to Capitol Hill, and as I was in front of the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade was overturned.
Wow.
And regardless of anyone's thoughts on Roe versus Wade, because that's not in my wheelhouse, I try to, stay in my own lane.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court just showed, yes, we do overturn.
Right.
And now they need to show that they're also going to say, and will take a stance against sexual violence that leads to unwanted pregnancies.
Oh, yes.
And all of a sudden, those same legislators started calling me and saying, now there's a window. So in October, I'm supposed to go back and meet with several legislators for a roundtable to discuss how we might be able to do this. So there's a window open. We'll see what happens.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I say that because I hope it isn't my daughter that is sitting in your chair someday, but it might be. And it might not just be my daughter, right? Like, I think sometimes we discount the fact that this can also happen against boys and men
Absolutely.
too.
Yep.
And so as we close here, I know that you've experienced the grace of God in so many ways. And I guess as we close out, I just want to know, in the midst of the trauma, is there anything you would share where you just have that tangible moment of like, you just knew that the grace of God was all around you and was empowering you really to just keep taking the next step?
Well, first of all, that journaling and listening to God's response.
Yeah.
I was amazed on a daily basis how God would speak to me individually and tell me he loves me, he's with me, he supports me. I just really recommend doing that. And I don't know if it's okay to say this, I actually sell black journals with white pens on my website called Brighter Future, because that to me was so profound and so personal.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, we tend to call everybody who's experienced sexual violence a survivor. And the truth is, we're not all survivors. We're not all surviving. There are some people who really are still very much dead inside.
Yeah.
So I do use the word victim, but I want everyone to be a survivor. It takes hard work. So I just want to encourage anybody who's experienced sexual violence, do the hard work of surviving. And part of that might be getting therapy. Part of that is going to be talking to somebody that you trust, not keeping it stored in a box in the back of your mind, but really addressing what has happened to you and finding healing.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Where your website is, Lisa? I want to make sure people know. It's not .org. Tell us what it is.
It's lisasaruga.com.
Awesome. And you guys can connect with her there. She has, like she said, the journals, the pens, and other resources for you. But thank you for the work that you're doing, for the way that you point to the Lord in that work, and also for coming on and so, vulnerably sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please take a moment to follow Lisa's work at lisasaruga.com. And I would be honored if you would share this episode with a friend. Tap into your current listening app and click the share button. Most listening apps have made it extremely easy to share. Just this week, I showed someone how to listen on Amazon Music. Grace Enough Podcast can be found on most listening apps, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, and Amazon Music.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough Podcast. Tune in next time.